listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and this week we are in conversation with Krystian Seibert. Now, Krystian is an Associate Commissioner with the Productivity Commission in Australia. You'll hear a bit more from Krystian in a moment about what the Productivity Commission actually is. But Krystian is a philanthropy expert in Australia and has been for a long time, and I've known Krystian for many years now. He used to work at the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University of Technology, where he was an industry fellow, and before that he worked at Philanthropy Australia, which is the main infrastructure body for philanthropy in Australia, or peak body as they call it over there, and he also was an advisor to Philanthropy Australia for quite a while after that. And Krystian, as you'll hear, joined the Productivity Commission specifically to work on a big inquiry that they've been doing into philanthropy in Australia, which had relatively recently produced a draft report at the back end of last year, and that's kind of what I sat down to talk to Krystian about. So we talked a bit about how that whole inquiry by the Productivity Commission came about, and then we sort of dived into some of what was in that draft report, which I think is really interesting for anyone who is interested in the whole question of government's role in supporting and encouraging a culture of philanthropy, how you go about doing that, what some of the rationale is, and that kind of thing. So we talked a bit about things like tax incentives. Obviously, the context in Australia is quite different from how it is in the UK or in the US, although there are similarities. But we talked about the sort of underlying question of the rationale that a government might have for wanting to offer tax relief on donations, which the report really kind of digs into, and then what that means in terms of the form within which you offer those tax incentives. We talked a bit about the kind of broader question of how you can actually use policy making to encourage philanthropy, whether there are limits to that, what government's role is in relation to philanthropy, whether it is essentially to kind of get out of the way and remove barriers, or whether it needs to take a more proactive role. We talked about the importance of data and what some of the recommendations in the report were around that. We talked about these things called private ancillary funds, which are essentially the kind of Australian tax legal designation for foundations, and some of the sort of specific rules around those that I thought were quite interesting. And then we also talked about one of the most fascinating recommendations in the report, which is about the creation of a new philanthropic fund designed to be owned and controlled by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So Krystian and I talked a bit about, what the background to that was, what the rationale was, what that policy recommendation was designed to achieve, what the reception to it had been and where it might go in the future. And then we talked a bit about what the plans were next for the report, what the process was, and what the ambitions were, and where things might go next in terms of philanthropy in Australia. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation. I thought it was a really, really interesting one. If you don't know much about the context for philanthropy in Australia, I think there's a huge amount just to learn about that, but also I think it kind of has a lot of relevance for anyone listening in the UK, the US, Europe, Canada, and elsewhere. I think there's some pretty kind of fundamental shared truths about the role that government can play in trying to encourage a culture of philanthropy within a country. So I will be back at the end of the podcast for the usual bit of housekeeping. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Krystian Seibert. Hi there, Krystian.
Hi, Rodri. How are you going?
I'm good, thank you. And for those of you listening, will probably already have heard, Krystian is an Associate Commissioner with the Productivity Commission in Australia, who've just brought out a really interesting draft report on philanthropy following a whole investigation they've been doing with kind of submission, calls for evidence, and lots of kind of really fascinating stuff in there. So that's what we here to talk about today. So maybe the best place to start is for you to just tell everybody a bit about, what the Productivity Commission is, because people outside Australia probably aren't aware of that, how the investigation into philanthropy came about, and what some of the things, the kind of key headlines from the draft report so far are.
Yeah, so the Productivity Commission, it's an independent Australian government body that provides policy advice to the Australian government to assist them with making well-informed policy decisions. So it's an independent commission. So it's different to, say, a department. It's an independent standalone statutory commission. It's a permanent statutory commission. And yeah, basically it undertakes public inquiries on major economic, social and environmental policy issues at the request of the government. It also self-initiates research on topical issues and contributes to public debate to encourage informed policy discussion. And really it's about trying to advance and promote evidence-based policies developed through extensive engagement with stakeholders to improve policy outcomes for the community as a whole. So a really notable aspect of the Commission and its approach is that it doesn't just look at, well, what could benefit a particular sector, but it looks at the community as a whole and what's in the interests of the community as a whole. So yeah, it was established in 1998 and it's been responsible for many significant reforms in terms of developing the ideas and proposals. And then it's up to government to decide what to do. The Commission makes recommendations to the government, and then the government decides whether to accept them or not and what to do. But yeah, it's a really interesting organisation and it covers a whole range of different topics and areas in its inquiry. And one of the inquiries that it's doing right now is the philanthropy inquiry. And in terms of how the philanthropy inquiry came about, so my previous roles, I was at two previous roles. I was an academic at a research centre here in Melbourne called the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne University of Technology, but I was also at Philanthropy Australia, the peak body for philanthropy in Australia, for many years. And one of the projects I was involved with at Philanthropy Australia was during COVID, developing the so-called blueprint to double structured giving in Australia by 2030. And it was a kind of a comprehensive policy manifesto, effectively, for growing structured philanthropy in Australia. And the current Australian government, when they were in opposition before May 2022, they basically adopted that target to double giving by 2030, but giving more broadly defined rather than just structured giving through foundations. So yeah, they adopted that target, that objective, and when they won the 2022 election and came into government, they were thinking about, well, how can they sort of, try and achieve that target, that objective? And yeah, that's how the Commission inquiry came about. So this inquiry, it started in February last year, February 2023, when the terms of reference were given to the Commission when I was appointed by the Australian government as an Associate Commissioner. So I'm an Associate Commissioner. I've got two other Commissioners with me that are co-leading or jointly leading the inquiry, and we've got a team of very capable, hard-working staff with diverse backgrounds, economics, in other frameworks and fields that are the team that are working on the inquiry together.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear, and you sort of gave a bit of a sense of it there in terms of how this came about. It's an ambitious goal to double giving, certainly within any space of time, but within a relatively short period of time. In terms of what the starting point is, just to give people a sense, what does the current environment for giving and philanthropy in Australia look like? And obviously that's a pretty difficult, nebulous question, and you can feel free to use a big broad brush. But are we talking about a sector that's dominated by high net worth giving or mass market giving? How much corporate giving are we talking about? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so it's actually really important to point out too that our terms of reference are very broad in terms of they include sort of donations of money, but also donations of time, volunteering. So they're obviously very different things, and they're influenced by different levers, etc., and can face different challenges. So it's quite broadly defined. In terms of sort of where Australia is at in terms of giving, so the charities sector in Australia, there's 60,000 charities in Australia, and about 7% of their their annual revenue, based on the most recent data, comes from donations. So their annual revenue is 190 billion Australian dollars, which is around US 125 billion, just under 100 billion pounds. And about 7% of that comes from donations. And the split is really sort of most of it, like 44% is from individuals, including sort of the mass market. Around 14% is from trusts and foundations. Bequests make up a relatively small proportion, 4%. And then corporates, they make up about 39%. But the challenge, we don't have that good data on some of these things, which is one of the things that we address in the draft report. But yeah, it's the giving is not sort of the main source of revenue for charities, but it's still an important source, and it can be used for particular things. And it's also interesting that there are particular dynamics in the sense that, like, obviously the largest 10% of charities receive the vast bulk of donations. I think so. The largest 10% receive 94% of all donations. But interestingly, smaller charities tend to be more dependent on donations rather than larger ones that might have grants from government and contracts or do trading to further their purposes as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. It certainly echoes, I think, some of the trends that we see here in the UK. One thing that struck me was when you were talking as well, in terms of how this might relate to wider debates that are going on in around kind of philanthropy and giving in other places. Is there any sense of a narrative in Australia about concerns that giving might be in decline, or that, kind of participation in giving is down, and that there's any sort of hollowing out of mass market giving and an over-reliance on larger donors? Because I know that's certainly something that's a very big cause of concern in the US and to some extent in the UK as well. Yeah,
well, some of the trends that we see elsewhere are being mirrored in Australia, in that we've had quite strong growth in donations of money. Volunteering is another matter, so we've seen sort of formal volunteering declining, but growth in sort of donations of money has been going up quite strongly and quite consistently as well. But based on the data we've got, participation in that form of giving is actually going down. So, for example, in a few years back in 2021, 28% of taxpayers claimed a deduction, which is not a perfect measure for a donation to a charity, whereas in 2010-11, sort of 10 years before that, 38% were claiming a deduction. So I think we're seeing growth in giving, but less participation. We are seeing the growth in high net worth giving, and more foundations being established, which in Australia are called private ancillary funds, which is similar to the private foundations in, say, the US and probably in the UK as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get into the weeds a bit on some of the things around how donations are treated in the tax system and what your recommendations are about that. And just before I do, there's a couple of other things I think on this wider context point. One that I was interested in is, I guess, in terms of wider trends about philanthropy worldwide. One is that I think certainly over the last decade or so, there's been a much clearer environment in which there's kind of critical assessment and scrutiny of philanthropy. Again, a lot of it, as ever, kind of coming from the US and driven by specific concerns over there, many of which do have analogues elsewhere, some of which don't necessarily have as clear analogues, but that's not always taken into account. But in the Australian context, do you get a sense that some of those critiques of philanthropy that we see in the US resonate, or are kind of having an impact on the way in which people think about or talk about philanthropy over there? And has that played any part in the thinking that you've done in the Productivity Commission?
Well, it's not as pronounced as, say, it is in the US, because I think there's a very different socio-political context there. Philanthropy and big philanthropy has played much more of a role there for a much longer period of time. Whereas in Australia, obviously, similarly probably to the UK and some other European countries, there's governments traditionally had a bigger role, and philanthropy has been there, but it hasn't probably been as prominent as, say, in the US. But that is changing. So over the last decade, we've had our first philanthropic foundations with sort of assets over $1 billion being established, and we're seeing now sort of wealth from the tech sector as well being generated here. So the landscape is changing. You do see sort of some of those critiques sometimes, and they did come through in our submissions, in some of our submissions. So we received over 270 submissions earlier in 2023 in response to our call for submissions, and they raised a whole range of different things. But some of them did raise the point that, well, and this is the familiar point that's made that when governments have tax revenue and they fund things, well, there's some democratic oversight there, etc. Whereas when philanthropy supported through tax incentives, tax concessions, it doesn't have the same democratic oversight, and the policies and the regulatory arrangements can have an impact on democratic governance as well. So it certainly came through in some submissions, and we do sort of draw that out in the draft report. We really sort of want to look at everything through that sort of, so to speak, critical lens, not to criticise, but to look at everything in terms of its advantages, its disadvantages. So this is not about just going, oh, philanthropy is wonderful, everything about philanthropy is good. Like, we are really sort of analysing the context, the different roles of government, of philanthropy, to really understand sort of, those dynamics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that gives us a natural point at which to come on to getting into the weeds slightly on one of the issues that sort of looms large in the report, which is around the system of tax relief on donations, which I think would be really interesting to people reading the report anywhere, because it's obviously what you say is specific to the Australian context, and it'd be interesting to sort of hear a little bit about what the sort of specifics of that context are. But because you do dig into the kind of underlying points about not just, how the specific deductions or kind of incentives are structured, but what the underlying rationale is for governments offering just, tax incentives in the first place, it has a much more universal feel to it. Maybe let's come on to that sort of slightly more theoretical stuff in a second. But I mean, just to give people a sense, what are we talking about at the moment in terms of what the system looks like for a donor when they're making donations and might want to get tax relief on it in Australia?
Yeah, so in Australia, basically, unlike say in the UK or the US, where when you're a charity or a non-profit, a 501c3 in the US, you get that status, and then any donation to you is tax deductible. Here, you become a charity, a registered charity, with the ACNC, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. But then, in order to receive tax deductible donations, you then need to still be endorsed by our Australian Taxation Office, and not every charity is eligible for that. So that's different to say, the UK, the US, where it's much broader, the eligibility. Here, part of the problem is that there's lots of about half of charities aren't actually eligible and can't receive tax deductible donations. And happy to talk about sort of why that's the case and how that arose and the issues with it. But basically, the ones that are eligible, and so say your typical sort of welfare charity would be eligible, etc. But the ones that aren't eligible can include, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, which was a organisation that won the Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago. It started out actually in Melbourne, and now it's a global charity. But its Australian arm, it's not eligible because it's sort of an advocacy organisation. Many advocacy organisations aren't eligible. But basically, if an organisation is eligible, then a donor donates anything above $2 to it, and it's tax deductible. It's a marginal tax rate deduction. Unlike, say, Canada or New Zealand that have a credit, it's uncapped. So you can donate all your income, get it down to zero, and pay no tax if you wanted to do that. Whereas, say, in the US, there are caps, etc. So it's uncapped in Australia. So in one sense, the scope is narrower, but it's quite generous in terms of being able to claim the deduction.
Yeah, I mean, similar, in that uncapped nature to the UK then. And I suppose that immediately, for people who are sort of aware of the difference between credit-based and deduction-based systems will immediately sort of think, well, it's probably subject to some of those concerns about upside down effects then, where, people who are paying more tax already get more value out of the deduction and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and people who don't pay any tax don't get any deduction. And our tax-free threshold in Australia, there's some discussion at the moment about increasing it. It's sort of 18,000 Australian dollars. So if, you're a retiree and you're sort of getting your retirement income, which is tax-free in Australia, you don't really benefit from any incentive.
Which brings me to the point that that kind of thing seems like almost a sort of technical specification about how you design these incentives. And similarly, your point about the fact that in Australia there is a distinction between those organisations that are recognised as charities and then a smaller subset of them that are eligible to receive these tax reliefs. Again, this seems like kind of sort of a technical point, but actually it goes to sort of a fundamental question about why it is that you're offering these incentives, because it's that dictates how you structure them. I'd be really interested to hear why there is that distinction between things that are seen as, okay, yes, that can be a charity, but then saying, well, yeah, but some of them, they can be a charity, but it's not allowed to have tax relief, because that says something really interesting about how the government views the purpose of the tax relief.
Yeah, well, and our tax deduction's been around for sort of over 100 years in Australia. And it's evolved in this really ad hoc manner. It started out sort of that there was a deduction for basically sort of welfare charities called public benevolent institutions here. And then over the years, sort of a bit like paper mache or a ship sort of sailing through the water with barnacles kind of being attached, it just kind of, little other categories were added. Oh, this category of charity will make them eligible, we'll make that one eligible. And then 100 years later, it's just like Swiss cheese. Like there's various organisations that are eligible, but then various ones that miss out. And there isn't really any coherent overarching policy rationale for it. So, for example, you can be a charity trying to prevent illnesses in children in Australia, you're eligible. But if you're trying to prevent injuries in children, you're not eligible. It's not because someone sat down and said, no, we don't want them eligible. It's just evolved in this really ad hoc manner. And it's, one of our main findings is that framework, it's called the deductible gift recipient framework in Australia. It's not fit for purpose, and it needs comprehensive reform to broaden the scope of eligibility, simplify it, because it is the framework really that sort of sits at the foundations of the giving of money in Australia. And our draft report's called the Future Foundations for Giving for a reason. It's about sort of making sure those foundations are solid as giving grows into the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it's incredible in how many contexts around the world, when you dig into how systems for tax incentives on donations work, it is often some sort of odd mishmash of historical happenstance and kind of evolution over time, rather than a clear set of principles about what the policy is designed to achieve, and then kind of focusing it according to that. And it sounds like that's very much the case there. I guess given that, and you're sort of saying the system was designed with one very, very limited purpose in mind a long time ago, and it's evolved over time, and you're saying now it's not necessarily fit for the purposes that you would envisage, a system of kind of tax incentives on donations having. What are you recommending is best to do about that? Because obviously there's the challenge of, it's very difficult when you have an incumbent system to suggest just ripping the whole thing up and starting from scratch. But then if you do need fundamental reform, how do you do that whilst maintaining the benefit that probably the non-profit sector in Australia already feels that there is from the system and would be reluctant to lose?
Yeah, and it's important to sort of qualify sort of what we're proposing is that we've got a draft report with draft recommendations, and we're doing further consultation. We've got public hearings. We'll be receiving further submissions. It's all sort of happening in the next few months before we provide our final report to the government in May. But basically with this DGR framework or system, as it's called, we're basically proposing to broaden the scope of eligibility and tie it more closely to your particular charitable purpose, or it's called a registration subtype in Australia. But still, there would be some categories of organisations under our draft proposals that would become ineligible. And then we're also not expanding it to all charities. So sort of one group of charities that we're not proposing to expand it are charities with the sole subtype of advancing religion. So your churches, mosques, synagogues, etc. I mean, that if there's a welfare arm attached to it or something, that's different. That would be eligible, but just for the purely sort of the practice advancement of religion wouldn't be. It's not eligible right now, and it wouldn't become eligible under our proposals. But I think the main thing we're trying to do is provide some sort of overarching coherence, some sort of policy framework for this to sit in, to avoid the situation that we're in now, where it's just evolved in this ad hoc manner. There's all these holes. You try and plug a hole, and something pops out somewhere else. It's really sort of what happens, and then we have a situation here where sometimes charities miss out; they're ineligible, and they can get what's called a specific listing, where they actually pass like an amendment to the tax laws here and name the charity in the tax laws to make it eligible, because they're not eligible through the sort of the standard process. And I think we're trying to develop that overarching sort of policy framework, and taking it a step back as well. We're sort of thinking like, why should government support philanthropy? What is the rationale? Not sort of just taking it as a given, because going back to what I said at the start, the Commission takes a community-wide perspective. So it's not just thinking about the sector, it's thinking about sort of the role of government here, that there are trade-offs, and we're adopting that sort of an approach.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that fundamental question is really fascinating, because it always strikes me when people are asked that question, or people, particularly sort of politicians or policymakers who haven't thought about it before, the default assumption that they leap to is, oh, well, in some sense, it's those charities are delivering social goods that otherwise the government would have to provide, so it's a good use of money. So there's almost a kind of direct subsidy idea. But there are reasons to think that's not necessarily the best way of thinking about why it's a good idea for governments to offer that, partly because it, I think, sets unrealistic expectations about what philanthropy can do. But also maybe it's a bit more limiting, in that if the only things that government wants to offer tax subsidies for or for donations to are things that are in line with government policy, maybe that's an overly narrow conception. Where did you sort of come down on those kinds of concerns?
Yeah, so we've got a whole chapter which sort of sets out our assessment approach, which looks at what the role of government is and should be in terms of supporting philanthropy and what the rationale for that is. And I think that we wanted to do that to, again, give a kind of a policy framework to our entire report. And I think it's actually quite surprising, given how dependent philanthropy is on the tax environment and tax incentives, regulation, that around the world this hasn't really, I don't think it's really been done. I mean, there was the Filer Commission in the US in the 1970s, which was very comprehensive. But generally philanthropy there's been kind of reviews that have looked at sort of the not-for-profit sector sort of quite broadly, but not sort of specifically sort of at the different levers that the government have got in the context of philanthropy. And I think chapter 2 of our draft report will have, and our final report will be relevant, I think, anywhere really, in terms of our discussion of what the role of government is in this context. I mean, really we adopt the approach that philanthropy can help fill gaps in market and government provision of goods and services, drawing on what you said earlier, and that governments can play a role supporting philanthropy to help improve efficiency and equity when markets and governments fail to deliver socially desirable outcomes, and that also philanthropy can build social capitals where relationships form within communities between donors and charities, between donors and beneficiaries, and those sorts of relationships facilitate trust and cooperation within groups, within the community, within society, which has positive benefits. But also we do discuss the fact that, well, we need to consider that when we support philanthropy, be aware that government and philanthropy have limitations. They can not meet community expectations, and those things that we talked about earlier, that there are trade-offs here. So governments can support philanthropy through new incentives, but that involves what we call, at least in Australia, a tax expenditure. When you provide a new tax incentive or a new tax concession, and there might be more philanthropy as a result of it, but there's less tax revenue. So there's less revenue that government can then spend on funding services and community priorities. So there are those sorts of trade-offs, and we've been very mindful of them throughout our work. But also what we talked about earlier, that government has got various advantages and disadvantages. Philanthropy does too. And say with philanthropy, you don't have the same oversight that you do with government, but that can be a good thing. It can mean that philanthropy can fund innovation, take risks, etc., that government might not. And there's that sort of pluralist argument in terms of philanthropy can sort of represent the diversity of viewpoints that might not necessarily be reflected by government policy and funding priorities. So we adopt a very broad and holistic approach to understanding and concluding. We do conclude that there is a role for government to support philanthropy, and then the main levers are tax incentives, regulation. There's a role in terms of information as well.
And I guess the other sort of follow-on point from that is, if you get to the point of thinking, well, there is a clear rationale for why government should want to incentivize philanthropy, which again, I agree. I can certainly come up with one in my own mind. I'm not sure it's always the one that ends up in other sorts of policy discussions, but I think there is one. That still, I guess, leaves open a question in terms of what the exact policy aim is, because I think even when it comes to encouraging philanthropy, you can distinguish between policies that are designed to try and get more people giving, so to increase participation in philanthropy, get people giving more, so those people are already giving, to get them to incentivize them to kind of increase the amounts, or to incentivize better types of giving, or giving to different types of, or to kind of make sure that the distribution of giving is kind of changed in some way. In terms of your thinking about your recommendations for government policy around philanthropy, are you focusing on any one of those in particular, or are you trying to sort of balance between all of them?
Yeah, we've certainly got an awareness that, your policy levers could say encourage giving in aggregate, to grow giving, the amount. But yeah, it could be, is that through smaller donations, through the mass market? Is it through high net worth individuals and setting up private foundations, which then has an impact in terms of, if a charity receives a few $1 million from sort of just small donors, well, it's kind of untied funding that it can use for its charitable purposes. Whereas if it's from foundations, then it can be sort of project specific, etc. And then if you grow high net worth philanthropy, then there's those implications for democratic governance and those sorts of things. So that, again, there's always trade-offs everywhere. So we don't sort of say, it should be grown through small untied donations, or we sort of look at it, the bigger picture, but just draw out these sorts of trade-offs. Because you could grow giving immensely just by focusing on the high net worth donors, but then that could change the makeup, the look of the charity sector. What's funded, what's not funded, what their priorities are, etc. So I really need to be aware of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to pick up on a few other things, because there's a lot of other stuff. I'd quite like to come back. You mentioned briefly there around sort of something to do with structures, and I'd like to touch on some of the specific stuff around ancillary funds, because I think it's relevant to wider concerns around foundations. But before we do that, I'm really keen to pick up on the recommendations in the report about establishing a new philanthropic fund that's specifically owned and controlled by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, which I think is really fascinating, because it's obviously very specific to the context of Australia, but in terms of its focus on trying to balance philanthropy against the demands of justice and recognizing kind of historical injustice and using philanthropy as a means of making reparation. It has echoes, I think, for conversations that are going on very much in the US, but in the UK and elsewhere. Maybe you could just say a bit about sort of the context for that recommendation and what it is that the report is actually recommending.
Yeah, and for our inquiry, we had an Indigenous engagement strategy, because we really wanted to ensure that we can centre Indigenous voices in the work of this inquiry. And so we engaged very extensively with a diverse range of Indigenous people and organisations. And we recognised too that the practices of altruism and generosity in Australia didn't start with European settlement and colonisation. They've been practiced in Australia by our Indigenous peoples for tens of thousands of years in many different ways, and they continue to be practiced until this day. And also, Indigenous people and organisations interact with philanthropic organisations, with trusts and foundations, and they have their own experiences of that. And through our engagement, we heard about sort of that there are examples of philanthropic organisations that are really supporting the goals and ambitions of Indigenous people and communities. But then sometimes philanthropic support is provided in a way that's not appropriate, that's not respectful, it doesn't meet the needs and aspirations of those communities. So there's sort of like a mixed report card. And so where this proposal came from, so basically it's a proposal for the Australian government to provide funding for an Indigenous-led philanthropic foundation to be established, and it would provide some initial funding, and then there'd be other funding provided from philanthropic organisations, and it would be Indigenous-led and controlled. Basically, the background to the proposal was that we listened to Indigenous stakeholders throughout our inquiry and engaged very extensively with them. And I think we came to an understanding that the distribution of wealth in Australia is obviously a product of government policy decisions in the past, including sort of that distribution in relation to Indigenous people and communities. And at the same time, that there is a growing sort of change within philanthropy in terms of recognising the importance of the autonomy of Indigenous people and communities, their self-determination, and providing philanthropic support in a respectful and appropriate manner. But there can still be barriers to accessing philanthropy that's provided in the appropriate way. And so the idea for this foundation was really that it would have a role in terms of, connecting Indigenous people and communities with sources of philanthropic funding and effectively sort of building capacity to engage with different sources of philanthropic funding, but also to have a role changing practices within philanthropy more broadly. And it's also something where, it's not something where you would think that government necessarily has to have a role. There is billions of dollars sitting within philanthropy in Australia, and an Indigenous-led philanthropic foundation, or many of them, could be set up without any government involvement. But it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened, and I think that that's very similar to, there's probably, maybe things are a bit different in the US, but again, the progress is pretty slow. So I think that this proposal is really about sort of responding to sort of what we've heard and the stories, the experiences shared with us, but also really sort of trying to initiate some change that doesn't seem to be happening.
And in terms of the wider context of this, some people listening might be aware, and I only know that sort of the bare bones of it, but there was obviously a referendum last year, I understand, on establishing more of a sort of policy mechanism. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, I think it was called, which would allow those communities to feed more effectively into the policy process and kind of have a say in setting policy at a local and national government level. But unfortunately, that referendum turned up a negative result in the end. So the idea wasn't taken forward. And so I wondered, in terms of the recommendation you're making for the establishment of this philanthropic fund, whether you think that kind of makes the case for it even more, even stronger, or whether you think actually it sort of presents more challenges in terms of achieving that recommendation.
Yeah, so we did have a referendum in October last year where the proposal was to establish an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, so like an advisory body that would be sort of codified within our we have a written constitution here, and it would be an advisory body comprising representatives from the Indigenous communities to Parliament to the executive as well. And yeah, the referendum wasn't successful, so that won't be happening. I think that this isn't directly related to that, but it is more broadly related to sort of the government priority, but also within the community and within sort of debate more broadly about recognising the importance of the autonomy of Indigenous communities, their right to self-determination, and philanthropy is already, there are examples of philanthropy already supporting that in Australia, but this is really about sort of accelerating that. So there are some common themes there, and I think that it'll be interesting to see with this proposal, and obviously it's just in our draft report, the draft proposal, when it's in the final report, sort of how it feeds into these broader debates that are happening about where Australia should go now, where government policy should go now, following the defeat of that referendum.
Yeah, it will be really interesting to see where that recommendation goes. I think it's certainly one that people I know who've become sort of aware of the draft report in other places have really picked up on, because it is such a, it is interesting, as I say, it kind of has resonance for lots of other contexts.
And we're doing further engagement with Indigenous stakeholders to really understand and to listen to what their perspectives and their views are on this proposal. And there's also a bit of a balancing act in the sense that there is this draft recommendation, but there's a limit as to how much detail we would ever set out, because we make it very clear in there that the design of this has to be Indigenous led. It's not for us to do the detail. It has to be Indigenous led, and it's going to be controlled and run by Indigenous people for the benefit of Indigenous communities.
No, exactly. You can't tell people exactly how they now need to be self-determined. It sort of defeats the point, doesn't it? I'm aware that we're going to be in danger of running out of time. So I just want to touch on a couple of other things. You mentioned already one, which is about what are known in Australia as private ancillary funds. But I guess, they're probably the analogue of what would be called foundations in lots of other contexts. It'd be really interesting, obviously, in the context of the fact there's a lot of debate about foundations in the US and the UK and in Europe around, their endowments, how much of their endowments they're willing to spend, the rate at which they're giving out grants, all these kinds of things. What your findings were and what your recommendations are in the context that you're working in.
Yeah, so in Australia we have private ancillary funds, which are very similar to, say, private foundations in the US. They have a 5% minimum distribution or payout rate, for example, and they're sort of subject to relatively similar form of regulation. We also have public ancillary funds, which are like a public foundation. You can have sub-funds in them, which are equivalent of a donor-advised fund or a DAF. So we look at all of them. And basically, over time, donations into these private ancillary funds, or PAFs as they're called, have gone up as a share of total donations. So in 2011-12, 15% of total tax-deductible donations went into them. It's up to 27% in 2020-21. So you've got them taking up more of a proportion of donations. And the implications of that obviously are that when you put money into a private foundation versus, say, donated directly to a charity, there's a temporal gap there in terms of when the money can be used by a charity to benefit the community. So the minimum distribution or payout rate is that sort of that lever that the government's got to at least ensure some sort of steady flow, minimum amount flowing to charities and the broader community. So what we do is we actually sort of come up with a rationale for why you have a minimum distribution. And I know that, say, in the UK there isn't one, but really the argument there is that you can have a situation where, say, the preferences of the trustees of foundations or the donors don't align with the preferences of the wider community or the government in terms of the flow of funds going out into to charities and benefiting the community. So you can have that mismatch. And so the minimum distribution is basically just like some sort of an assurance that there will at least be a minimum amount going out. And we use sort of an economic framework, principal agent theory, to really sort of draw that out. But yeah, we also do basically a cost benefit analysis of if you say have a $1 million donation going into one of these PAFs in year one, and then you have sort of the flow of grants at 5% coming out over the next, say, 10, 15, 20 years, and then you calculate a net present value to sort of basically look at how long it takes for sort of the government, the taxpayer, to get a return on that tax deduction. So we sort of do a cost-benefit analysis, and we don't have a recommendation to change the minimum distribution, but we are asking for views in our draft report about whether it should be changed. And then we'll make a decision for the final report. But we certainly think that there is a role for having a minimum distribution, and it's an important lever in terms of ensuring that there is that minimum amount of philanthropic funding flowing out to charities and benefiting the community. And we also look at, these public ancillary funds, or called PUAFs, as they're sometimes called, and the sub-funds. And we don't propose, say, a minimum distribution for sub-funds, whereas, say, in the US there are calls for a minimum distribution for DAFs, but we do propose that there be some additional transparency and reporting, so we can at least have some data on what the trends are, what the dynamics are, and some transparency around that, sort of at least as a first step.
And just so I'm clear on these kind of sub funds, or the things that you're saying are the equivalent of DAFs. Is it closer to the context in the US, for example, where the vast majority of the market for DAFs is taken up by kind of commercial DAF providers, in the sense of commercial financial institutions that have a non-profit arm and are then providing DAFs, almost as a product? So the sort of Fidelity, Vanguard, those kinds of organisations. Or what we have in the UK, which is that essentially the DAF market at the moment is very heavily skewed towards sub-funds within community foundations. So they're essentially sub-funds within a fund that itself is charitable and has a kind of charitable mission to distribute funds to a local community. Because I think it feels as though often the argument in the US is much more pointed, precisely because the incentives of the organisations that hold the vast majority of DAFs are, if not entirely misaligned. Obviously, there are kind of questions about whether they're entirely the right incentives to get the money distributed again, because obviously there's a strong incentive to keep assets under management. What's the situation there in Australia?
Yeah, it's certainly nowhere near what the US is in terms of sort of how DAFs have taken off over the last decade there. It's a mix. A lot of these public ancillary funds, these PUAFs, are operated by community foundations and other similar organisations, and you can open up a sub-fund there. But there are also wealth advisors that also operate a PUAF, and you can set up a sub-fund there too, but certainly not to the extent of the US, where you've got sort of, Vanguard, Fidelity, etc., and how they've taken off. But anecdotally and sort of based on the limited data, but I did a survey a few years back, they are growing, and they are also they're a substitute to a PAF or a private foundation, as we know in the US. The difference is in the US, they've got different tax treatment for a donation to a private foundation versus into a DAF. It's the same here, but they are a substitute. So we're also mindful of, again, about these trade-offs and these flow-on effects. You could change the regulation of PAFs, private foundations. You could say increase the minimum distribution, but then you might have more people setting up sub-funds, and they don't have a minimum distribution for each individual sub-funds. The public ancillary fund as a whole has got a 4% minimum distribution, but you could have sub-funds that are, just flow through, and then that would mean that, it would meet its 4% and still have sub-funds that are not donating, not granting out that much.
Yeah, absolutely. Was that a bird in the background? What?
Yeah.
What is it? Is it?
I don't know, but it's because it's quite high. I turn the air conditioning off, and then I open the window. The sun's setting. It's beautiful outside, and I've got some trees outside here
lovely,
and there.
My abiding memory of Australia is just the incredible variety of bird songs. So, but that's entirely by the by. I wanted to, before I let you go, just wanted to ask you something you've mentioned a couple of times already, and I think it's sort of an important point within the report, is the role that data can play within philanthropy, and what government should be doing to try and sort of drive an improvement in the amount and the quality of data that's available around philanthropy. I I guess the obvious question is, why is that important? But also, what do you think government can be doing, and sort of, what does the non-profit and the philanthropy sector need to be doing, and what sort of data is it that we're talking about here?
Yeah, well, I think the starting point is that we've actually got a lot of data on charities and philanthropy in Australia. So going back 10 years when the our charities regulator, the ACNC, was set up, which I worked on setting up when I was an advisor to the Australian government back then, that you actually didn't know how many charities there were in Australia. You didn't know their revenue. I mean, there was no reporting or anything like that. So the amount of data was very limited. We've got so much more data now because of the ACNC charities reporting, and that's all made available publicly. So we've got a lot of data, but there are still data gaps. So, for example, around bequests, we have data gaps here. Around corporate giving, and we've got recommendations around both of those things. So one of the things we're proposing, for example, is that with corporate giving, that larger companies, so listed companies, for example, should have to publicly report on their donations, so that all stakeholders, shareholders, charities, others that are interested, can have a picture of what their contributions are through philanthropy. So I think that the importance of data is that if you don't measure something, then you don't know how you're tracking in terms of increasing, and if you've got a goal to double giving and you want to just grow giving, if you don't have data, well, how do you know if you're meeting that goal? And also, say with bequests, we're going to see a very large intergenerational wealth transfer in coming years, and there's sort of an expectation that sort of bequests will increase as a result of that. But if you don't have good data on that, well, then how do you know about that? But again, nothing is without, there are trade-offs. Nothing is free. Reporting can impose burden, can impose costs. So you have to really look at everything in terms of the broader context and, do we really need this? What kind of costs could it impose? What sort of benefits could it provide? That sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something we hear all the time here in the UK, and I think your point about being able to measure the policy change that you're trying to achieve is vital, because it's all very well to say that you want to sort of double philanthropy, but if you don't know what your starting point is and you're not able to track where you're getting to, then it kind of becomes a bit meaningless.
And making policy is so dependent on data. So I see in this inquiry, like how we use data that wasn't available 10 years ago or 15 years ago, how we use data to get insights that we then take to inform our analysis of whether there should be policy changes. So say, a little while ago I was talking about how, say, donations into these private and public ancillary funds have been increasing as a proportion of total donations. Well, that's data we can then use to sort of understand, okay, what does that mean? What are the implications of that for the regulatory framework, for example? So I think that, data is not everything, but it's really important in terms of informing policy development.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before I let you finally go, I'm just going to ask what's next in terms of the process for the report. I mean, what is it that you know to expect is coming, and what do you kind of hope and expect beyond that, once the final report's out?
So where we're at now is we released the draft report at the very end of November last year, 2023, and we've got another round of submissions now that close on the 9th of February, and we then do public hearings in a number of places around Australia. So it's anyone that wants to can participate and give evidence at public hearings on the record, and then we're also doing other consultations with different stakeholders to find out some more information in response to some of our draft recommendations and that sort of thing. So there's a lot more engagement and consultation to happen. Our final report is due to the Australian government in May this year. So it seems like it's far away, but it's going to go really quickly. Once it's provided to the Australian government, it's obviously their decision then in terms of what they do with the recommendations. But yeah, there's a lot of work that's going to happen between now and then. And because of some of the proposals we've got around reform of that DGR framework, that DGR system, particularly in the education space. So we're having a little bit of a similar kind of experience that the UK had some years ago around looking at sort of education and public and private benefit, and how sort of that balancing between public and private benefit interacts in the context of education and sort of the use of tax-deductible donations in Australia. So we're getting lots of submissions on that, and people at the public hearings. But it's an important debate and a discussion to have. And then we take all that we hear, that we read, that's put to us, and we analyse it, synthesise it, think about it. And the Commission does change draft recommendations between a draft report and a final report. But yeah, we sort of will be formulating our views and thinking to get our final report to the government by May this year.
Yeah, I'm really interested to hear, and I'd love to talk more about the public benefit of private education, but we'd be here for another couple of hours. So I think probably better not for now. But just remains to say thanks ever so much, Krystian, for finding the time to come on the podcast. It's really interesting to hear about the work you've been doing, and yeah, certainly wish you all the best with it. It'll be really interesting to see the final report when that comes out and to kind of track the progress of it.
Thanks for having me on your show, Rodri.
Great.
Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to Krystian for finding the time to come on the podcast and to talk about the work he's been doing. I'll put links in the show notes to places where you can find more about the work of the Productivity Commission, read the report if you'd be interested to do that, read some things that Krystian's also written about philanthropy over the years, some things that I've written about philanthropy that might be relevant to this conversation as well. I should just give a small apology. Obviously, I sounded absolutely terrible during that whole conversation. I should say this was recorded back in January and I had a pretty stinking cold at the time. It was around the time of my birthday, so I kind of traditionally am relatively ill at that point. If you're interested more broadly in any issues to do with philanthropy and civil society, do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com. There's all kinds of articles there. There's news updates on things I've been doing through Why Philanthropy Matters. There are also all the back issues of this podcast that you can check out, which is a really interesting growing archive of conversations at this point. If you want to follow me on social media as well and get kind of more regular updates, best place to do that at the moment is probably LinkedIn, but you can find me on various other places as well. If you like the podcast, subscribe to it or whatever it is you do these days. Follow, I think that's right. I keep saying leave us a nice review on iTunes, but I realise that that would be about 15 years ago. So I think Apple Podcasts is probably the thing, or wherever else you get your podcasts. But on a more personal level, if you know somebody that you think would be interested in the podcast, whether that's a colleague or a friend or somebody, an enemy perhaps, do tell them about the podcast. Share the good word, and hopefully we'll get more people listening to it in future. Other than that, I will see you next time. Bye.